Hello everyone and welcome back to another Babbling Irons video, and today something a little bit different because we've got our biggest game coming up next week in our Europa Conference League final against Fiorentina, and now it's come out with Michail Antonio on a podcast where he's been mentioning Scamacca and also David Moyes and just how this season hasn't gone right. And we're going to break down the video because there's a few interesting points here, and quite a few people have been saying, well, he shouldn't be saying this stuff, and to be honest, there might be some truth to that. So we're going to break it down. Let's get into it.
I'm gonna be honest with you lot. He's actually quality. He's a quality player.
I told you.
So immediately starts with praise for Scamacca. So we're on the right path. He's already said he's a quality striker, and it's what we've been saying since we signed him. Basically, we just haven't seen it. But what he says next is quite interesting. So let's listen a little bit closer.
The problem is,
I never told him.
the problem is he can't play the way the Gaffer plays. He needs a different type of manager to play his type of football.
English?
So he's basically confirming what most West Ham fans have been thinking for a long time, including what we've been saying on the channel over the past kind of 5-6 months, is that Scamacca's a quality striker. He just doesn't fit the way that Moyes wants to play. And it has to go back to the recruitment as to why he was signed and what type of profile the manager wanted. Because last summer, I think Moyes' preference was to go for Broja of Chelsea. Him and Scamacca are two completely different strikers, yet they were the big names, the big kind of 1 and 2 targets for that centre forward spot. So he even says there, it's not a Moyes type of player. He's not going to do what Antonio could do, for example, and what Moyes loves in a striker. So why on earth was he signed? That is the biggest question about this, because there's no doubt that Scamacca is a quality striker. He's still 24 years old and he is very technically gifted. And if you play to his strengths, he will score you a lot of goals. But we don't have that system. And it's interesting to see Antonio say that, because even himself is realizing that he doesn't fit the system.
He needs a manager he can play and then have like other players who come off him and stuff like that. Like you can see that ball comes into him, he sticks, and he's tidy. But how David Moyes plays is more like if you're up front, you're dealing with scraps, and you got to be more of a fighter.
And there you go again. Antonio again reinstating what we were all saying. You have to feed off scraps in a David Moyes team, and we've seen it because the first half of the season, we're going to get into what Antonio says about Moyes and the trying to adapt to the system in a minute, but you cannot play like that under Moyes. He has to get success under Moyes. You have to be a striker that's going to run the channels, that is going to feed off scraps, as Antonio's alluding to there, and is able to kind of turn defenses. And Scamacca isn't that type of player. He's great at holding the ball up. He's very technical, and he's great when you've got players around him running off of him, as Antonio says in there. So it's really interesting to hear an actual West Ham player speak about the situation and actually speak about Scamacca and kind of refer to everything West Ham fans have been saying. So I found that really interesting from Antonio. I completely agree with what he said. Do I agree that he said it? Absolutely not. This should not be public saying this when you've got the biggest game in probably West Ham's recent history coming up. And Scamacca is still one of your teammates. He's just out injured. So yeah, I'm not too happy with Antonio coming on and saying this stuff, but what he's actually saying does make sense. You then have the next part, which is really, really interesting, because Antonio speaks about Moyes' how at the start of the season, he wanted to change the way that we played and become a better team from what we'd previously built in the past 2 seasons. And he wanted to make those kind of signings to try and adapt the way that he wanted to play to fit the mold of a top 4, top 6 team. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. I think a lot of us had kind of reservations about it because Moyes has never really played that way, and it would be difficult to just change your entire philosophy and identity as a manager overnight. But let's get into what Antonio actually said and try and pick up on a few things that he mentioned on this podcast.
It was difficult this year because the last 2 years we've been close to the top 4 and we've just never achieved it. And because we were so close to it, the gaffer kind of changed how he wanted to play. He wanted to switch it up.
So you hear Antonio there say, he wanted to switch it up at the start. He wanted us to push into the Champions League. He wanted to build on that success that he'd built in 2 years, which is absolutely the right thing we should be aiming to do at that stage. I think every West Ham fan wanted that transition last summer and knew it probably wouldn't be easy. but thought that over time we would start to adapt and start to develop. I mean, you only have to look at someone like Arsenal. Look at what Michail Arteta's built in less than 3 years there. It can happen. It just has to be consistent. It has to take time, and you have to actually believe in what you're doing. I don't think Moyes deep down believed that he could do it. I think there was probably pressure from outside to try and do it and try and bridge that gap between the top four that we found ourselves in and the kind of top seven. I don't think Moyes was ever going to do that. He's never been that manager. So, yes, we kind of held out hope that he would, but it was just never going to happen. And that's when the wheels started to fall off for this season. And then obviously had the World Cup break. And that was probably the best time we could have switched because we could have brought in someone that could play with these players and could adapt to that kind of style. So, yeah, it was a strange decision to try and do that. If deep down you didn't know, as as a manager, you can't do it. So, yeah, a bit confusing there.
So we made some quality signings, Paqueta, John Luca, to obviously so we can try and break through the thirds and work it way that way, so we could play more like a top 6 team. But it just didn't work out for us, and literally we kept pushing it, kept trying to do it, even though we saw it weren't working from November, December times.
And there you have it. Antonio confirming what we've just basically touched on is that he signed these players like Scamacca, like Paqueta, to try and build on what was there to become a top 4 team and adapt the way we play. An interesting point there, play through the lines, break the final thirds, that kind of terminology. We've said it countless times on here. Moyes doesn't really have patterns of play and build up. It's more that counter-attacking fluid system with Antonio up front, and you have those runners working off him and set pieces. It's working in moments rather than building up patterns. You see it with different teams in the Premier League. Brighton, a prime example, obviously an exceptional example, but they have patterns in how they open up a team with the quality technicians they have. West Ham have some excellent ball playing players. We just don't know how to use it because Moyes isn't that type of manager. He doesn't know how to do it. So the players who are absolutely capable of doing it are being told to do something in a confusing way and a way that was just never going to work. So for me, it goes down to the manager that this didn't work. It's not to do with the players, it's to do with the manager. And if you can't get the system to work, that goes down to you and your tactics. And I don't for one doubt have, any concern that Paqueta, Scamacca, these types of players, again, would not thrive in a possession-based team because they absolutely would. So yeah, interesting to hear that. And what he goes on to say next is really interesting because the players themselves were actually aware of it at the time.
Yourself said that
everybody could see we weren't doing it, but but it was one of those things where we wanted to
see it out.
We wanted to try and get that philosophy going, so next season we can work on it and then build off it.
Yeah, definitely.
But then it got to a stage where we was like, now we're getting ourselves in trouble. Back to plan A.
Back to tape. Yeah.
And then that's how we've managed to drag us out of it and get
results.
And there we go. They tried it. They tested it. It didn't work. They thought they would have time to adapt. We knew that it was going to take time to adapt if they wanted to play this style and bringing in new players. Spending almost £200 million in the summer. It was always going to be a really tough task for a manager like David Moyes. So that's my biggest concern here is we want to progress as a football club. We brought in the players to do that. He had the funds to do it. He himself has not been able to implement the correct strategy or tactics. That is 100% down to the manager. I don't care what anyone is saying about Paqueta needing time to adapt, Scamacca not hitting the ground running. It plays a part, but not really, because those kind of things wouldn't happen. There would be less of an integration period if you had the tactics spot on from the start and the players kind of understood their responsibilities. It wasn't until recently that Moyes dropped Paqueta back to his best position, which is as an 8. And he said, when we first signed him, we thought he was more of a 10 and we're just learning his position. It even happened with Danny Ings in January, still finding the best way to use him. That should not happen when you're profiling transfers, which is why I've got concerns about this summer, but that's a completely different subject. So we'll leave that there. But yeah, Antonio kind of really goes into detail here about the whole situation. And I find it really bizarre that this is coming out a week before our biggest game of the season and recent history, but also just to say that, like, in general, and to sit there and say this stuff when you're still employed by the club, and B, your teammates are there sat listening to it as well. So I don't know what this will mean for Antonio moving forwards, but it can't be good. I would suspect that it won't be him leading the line next season. And now Moyes faces a dilemma because he has a player that has outed Scamacca, saying he's not a Moyes type of player. So if he keeps Scamacca this summer and tries to use him next year, how is that ever going to work? How is that player relationship going to work? How is the whole dynamic of the squad going to work? It's really quite bizarre, and I'm very apprehensive, and I'm not happy with Antonio saying this stuff, because you're employed by the club. You cannot be saying that kind of thing. And yeah, it's really bad timing. But what did you guys think? I actually believe Antonio is telling the truth here, and saying what is kind of glaringly obvious throughout this season. But there's a time and place to say this, and B, you just shouldn't be saying it right now. It really shouldn't come out into the media, when you're preparing for the biggest game in recent history. So what do you guys think? Let me know that, down below in the comments, what you think of this whole situation, and whether you think Antonio is right with what he's saying. Leave a comment, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and until next time, come on you Irons.